Larry Whittaker had one job: protect his family, but his decisions or lack of them set off a chain reaction that destroyed everything. How did a man meant to lead become the reason his family was ripped apart? This is the story of Larry Whittaker, a man who stood at the head of one of America's most talked about families, a man expected to lead with wisdom and strength, but whose silence and inaction allowed his family to fall into chaos. For years, the Whittakers lived in quiet isolation, tucked away in the hills of West Virginia. Their lives were simple, their routines familiar, their world small but steady. They had each other, but everything changed when the world found them. When cameras arrived, when strangers started climbing the hill with microphones and money. In the beginning, Larry was there, standing in the frame, quiet, reserved, often watching from the side. He wasn't the loud one, not the one giving interviews or asking for help, but everyone could tell he was the one who held power, the one who decided who could come close, who could speak, who could film. To outsiders, Larry seemed like the guardian, the protector of his family's peace. But behind that silence was something else. It wasn't strength. It was avoidance. It was detachment. Larry watched as outsiders shaped his family's story. He watched as money started to flow, as videos about his family went viral, as people turned their suffering into clicks and profit. And when it was time for him to protect his loved ones, to speak up, to set boundaries, to lead, he said nothing. He let others take control. He let Betty, the matriarch, make decisions she was not prepared to make. He let her be the one answering to strangers, shaking hands, smiling for cameras. He allowed her to face the very people he should have shielded her from. And while Betty tried, her choices often came from confusion, desperation, and trust misplaced in people who did not have her family's best interest at heart. Larry stayed quiet, and in that silence, everything began to unravel. The family became divided. What was once private and sacred was now public and distorted. The world saw the Whittakers, but they didn't see the pain behind those faces. They didn't see the manipulation. They didn't see how deeply the family had become entangled with people who came promising help but left with views, fame, and profit. Larry could have stopped it. He could have stepped forward and said, "Enough." He could have been the voice of reason, the one to filter who came to their home, the one to set rules, to guard the door. But instead, he let the door stay open, and when that door stayed open, so did the chaos. Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray, three of the most vulnerable members of the Whittaker family, were removed from the home. The house that had been filled with their memories, their voices, their entire lives, was suddenly empty. Authorities intervened. The home, once a symbol of family, was declared unsafe, a place filled with clutter, filth, and neglect. And through it all, Larry watched. He watched as the people he loved were taken away. He watched as the family name became a topic of online debate. He watched as outsiders discussed their lives like entertainment. And even then, he said nothing. That's the tragedy of Larry Whittaker. It wasn't that he was a cruel man. It wasn't that he didn't love his family. It was that he chose silence over responsibility. He chose comfort over conflict. He chose to let others act, even when he knew they were leading his family in the wrong direction, and that silence cost him everything. When you look closely, you can see how the downfall of the Whittakers didn't happen overnight. It was slow, a quiet erosion. It started with one bad decision, then another. Betty agreeing to let people film. Larry agreeing to nothing but stopping no one. The money coming in and disappearing without explanation. Promises made and broken. The cracks deepened when people like Tyler and other content creators entered the story. Some say Tyler took advantage of Betty's trusting nature. Others believe Betty saw the money and ignored the consequences. But what no one can deny is that Larry was there, watching it all unfold, and when the time came to protect his family's dignity, to guard their story, to lead, he was nowhere to be found. People often say leadership isn't about words. It's about actions. But in Larry's case, leadership wasn't about either. It was about absence. His silence became the loudest sound in the room. Neighbors describe him as quiet, calm, hard to read. But behind that calmness was a man disconnected from his role. a man who had grown accustomed to watching things happen around him. Rather than shaping what happened to him, that pattern of passivity didn't just hurt him. It destroyed the people who needed him the most. The 3 family members removed from the home. They depended on him. They needed his strength, his guidance, his advocacy. But how can you fight for someone when you don't even stand for yourself? Larry didn't fight. He didn't confront. He didn't organize help. He didn't hold people accountable. He just stood there as the people who loved him the most were taken away, even as volunteers tried to clean up the property. Hoping to make it livable again, the truth was too painful to ignore. The house wasn't just dirty. It was unsafe. A reflection of years of neglect, not only physical but emotional. And while many blame Betty, the truth runs deeper. Because Larry lived there too. Larry saw it too. Larry had the power to change it. And he didn't. That is what makes this story so tragic. The Whittakers' downfall wasn't because of fame. It wasn't because of poverty. It wasn't because of outsiders alone. It was because the one person meant to protect them, the one person who had the chance to lead them toward something better, never stepped into that role. Larry Whittaker failed to protect his family, not because he didn't care, but because he refused to take responsibility. And when you refuse to lead, someone else will always step in. In this case, it was outsiders. Strangers with cameras, strangers with cash. Strangers who saw opportunity in a family suffering. That's how it all started. A man who should have stood tall instead chose to stand back. And what happens when the protector fails? The people he was meant to protect become the victims of the world. By the time Larry realized what was happening, it was already too late. The trust was broken. The family was divided. The home was condemned. The people were gone. The Whittaker story became a spectacle, and Larry Whittaker became the silent witness to his family's destruction. This was not the story of a villain. This was the story of a man who allowed the weight of leadership to crush him instead of carrying it. A man whose silence cost him his legacy. And as the world watched, the Whittaker name, once a private symbol of resilience, became a global conversation about tragedy, mental health, and the consequences of neglect. Larry Whittaker didn't destroy his family with violence. He destroyed it with silence when the county arrived to remove Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray from the Whittaker home. The air around Odd, West Virginia, changed forever. That small, weathered house on the hill, the one that had once been filled with the sounds of familiar voices, dogs barking and the steady rhythm of daily life, suddenly grew quiet. The laughter, the shouts, the echo of life inside those walls were replaced by stillness, and in that silence, one figure remained, Larry Whittaker. He stood there, a man alone, not just physically, but emotionally. His family had been fractured, and the world he knew had collapsed around him. Yet even then, he didn't speak. He didn't fight. He didn't protest. He just stood in the ruins of what used to be his home, what used to be his family's world, and watched it all fade away. This moment, the removal of his siblings, was the final consequence of years of inaction. It was the result of decisions unmade, responsibilities avoided, and truths ignored. For the county, it was a necessary intervention. Reports described unsafe living conditions, health hazards, and neglect. The word hazardous appeared again and again. The walls, once marked by fingerprints and memories, were now covered in filth. The floors, once walked by family, were coated in the evidence of years of decay. But for Larry, it was more than just a house being condemned. It was the symbol of his failure, the fall of the Whittaker home for years. That home represented the Whittaker legacy. It was where they laughed, argued, loved, and survived. It stood as a physical reminder of endurance, of a family that had been through generations of hardship, but never gave up. But homes don't collapse overnight. They break down slowly, just like families do. Bit by bit, things were ignored. The broken door never fixed. The clutter piling up in corners. The animals left unattended. The cleaning left undone. Every day, small acts of neglect built up until it became too much to hide. And through it all, Larry lived there. He saw what the county would eventually see. He saw the trash, the filth, the animal waste, the chaos. But rather than take control, he adjusted to it. He accepted the mess as normal. That's what long-term dysfunction does. It dulls your sense of urgency. It convinces you that the unacceptable is just another part of life. And Larry, a man who should have been the one to demand change, let the chaos consume his home, his family, and his purpose. Neighbors whispered. Visitors noticed. Even the content creators who came to film were taken aback by what they saw. But Larry didn't act. He let Betty bear the weight. Betty, the matriarch, loved her family deeply, but she wasn't capable of leading them. Her decisions were often impulsive, guided by emotion and a childlike trust in others. When outsiders arrived, waving money and cameras, Betty believed they were there to help. She let them in, Larry let them stay, and together, without realizing it, they opened the door to their family's undoing, the content creator chaos when. The first documentaries about the Whittakers surfaced. They drew the world's attention. Viewers were fascinated, confused, and emotional. They saw the family's struggles and humanity, but they also saw opportunity. YouTubers, filmmakers, and reporters began traveling to Odd, West Virginia, hoping to film their own stories. The Whittaker name became a magnet for content. Some came respectfully. Others came to exploit. Larry watched them come and go. There were times when he looked uneasy, standing off to the side, arms crossed while cameras focused on his siblings. But he never stopped them. Even when things didn't feel right, he didn't step in. He could have said, "Enough." He could have drawn the line and said, "No more cameras. No more interviews. No more exploitation." But he didn't. He let them film. He let the money pass hands. And when people began to question where the money went, Larry didn't explain. He didn't demand accountability. He didn't protect his family's dignity. He just disappeared into the background, quietly watching the drama unfold. That silence spoke volumes. The money and the misunderstandings. When you look at what happened financially, it becomes clear that confusion and manipulation played a huge role. There were payments, some from YouTubers, some from donors, some from people who just wanted to help, but the money was never managed properly. There was no system, no structure. Betty, whose judgment was often clouded, handled much of it. She trusted the wrong people. She believed false promises. And when people started whispering that she'd been tricked or used, the damage was already done. According to those close to the family, Betty only seemed motivated by cash. Not out of greed, but out of desperation. Money became the one thing that made her feel in control, and Larry? He knew this. He saw it. He knew she didn't have the mental capacity to make good decisions, and still, he let her handle it all. That was Larry's greatest mistake. Leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about protecting others from making the wrong ones. Larry didn't protect Betty from herself. He didn't protect his family from the people who used them. He didn't protect their home from becoming a hazard, and in the end, his silence allowed the destruction to spread like wildfire when the county stepped in. By the time the county finally intervened, the situation was beyond saving. The conditions were no longer livable. Feces on the walls, trash covering the floors, the smell of decay. The structure of the house itself was in danger. Volunteers began showing up, hoping to help clean up the property. People who had followed the family online wanted to do something good, to fix what had been broken. But the more they cleaned, the more they realized the truth. This wasn't just clutter. It was a symbol of years of neglect, trauma, and untreated mental illness. This wasn't a house that needed a mop. It was a family that needed therapy. Larry watched as strangers wore gloves and masks, cleaning the home he should have maintained. He watched as the community tried to do what he had ignored for years, and still, he said nothing, even as Betty's Facebook page began calling for volunteers, asking for bedding, furniture, and donations. Larry stayed quiet. He wasn't organizing. He wasn't leading. He wasn't fighting to bring his siblings back home. He had accepted it. The emotional cost of silence, for Larry. Silence became a habit. It was easier to stay quiet than to confront the truth. Easier to sit and watch than to take action, but silence, over time, turns into guilt. And for anyone who's ever carried the weight of guilt, it's heavy. It doesn't fade. It lingers in the background, reminding you of every moment you could have spoken up. Every moment you could have acted but didn't. Larry carries that weight now. He may never say it out loud, but every empty room in that house echoes with the voices that used to fill it. Every piece of trash on the floor, every mark on the wall, every space where someone used to sit, it all whispers the same thing. You should have done more. He lost his siblings not just to the system, but to his own indecision. Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray were taken away to be cared for elsewhere. The county deemed the home unsafe. The family that had once survived everything, poverty, illness, and ridicule, was now broken apart not by outside forces, but by their own inability to heal. Larry's failure wasn't sudden. It was slow. Painfully slow. It was the kind of failure that builds up over years of silence. The aftermath today. The Whittaker family exists in fragments. Some members remain in that old house, trying to rebuild. Others are gone, scattered under county care or living with relatives. Volunteers still check in, trying to maintain some level of dignity for what remains of the family legacy, but the once unbreakable bond between them has faded. Trust has been shattered. And Larry, the man who should have stood tall through it all, now stands in the ruins of his choices. He doesn't speak publicly. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't explain. Maybe he believes that staying silent keeps the peace. Maybe he believes that what's done is done. But silence is not peace. It's surrender, and that's what happened to Larry Whittaker. He surrendered his family, not to the county, not to the world, but to circumstance. He allowed others to lead where he should have stood. He allowed outsiders to define his family's story. He allowed confusion, chaos, and decay to become the legacy of the Whittaker name, all because he wouldn't speak. The tragic lesson of Larry Whittaker's story is not just a personal failure. It's a reflection of what happens when leadership disappears, when the person meant to protect the vulnerable refuses to act. He didn't destroy his family through malice or cruelty. He destroyed them through neglect, through silence, through waiting too long to do what should have been done long ago. And maybe that's the saddest part of it all, that it didn't have to be this way. If Larry had stood up earlier, if he had drawn a line with the content creators, if he had cleaned the house, if he had protected Betty from manipulation, if he had fought to keep his siblings safe, the Whittaker story might have been one of redemption, not ruin. Instead, it became a cautionary tale, the story of a man who watched his family collapse and did nothing, the story of a protector who refused to protect, the story of a silence so deep it swallowed his family whole. Larry Whittaker's silence is a reminder to us all. Families don't fall apart in one moment. They fall apart over time. One ignored warning, one avoided conversation, one missed opportunity to stand up and say, "No more." By the time you realize the damage, the people you love may already be gone, and that's what happened on that quiet road in West Virginia, where one man's silence became the sound of a family destroyed. The Whittaker family didn't just lose their home or their peace, they lost control of their story, and the reason why is simple. When a man refuses to lead, the world will lead for him. Larry Whittaker's silence didn't just open the door to chaos, it invited it in, and once that door was open, there was no closing it again. The cameras arrived. It began quietly. A single camera, a few questions, and a story that felt too strange to be real. A family living in rural West Virginia, isolated, poor, and misunderstood. At first, the world watched with curiosity. Then came fascination. Then came exploitation. The Whittaker name became a viral sensation. Documentaries spread across YouTube and social media, drawing millions of views. The faces of the family were everywhere. Thumbnails, titles, reaction videos, even memes. And while people online debated morality and empathy, the people inside that home, the ones being filmed, had no real understanding of how vast that attention had become. Larry was there for all of it. He saw the cameras being unpacked. He saw microphones pushed toward his family members. He watched Betty, confused but cooperative, smile awkwardly as strangers directed her like a movie star, and he did nothing. He Didn't ask who these people were. He didn't ask what they planned to do with the footage. He didn't ask where the money was going or how the family would benefit. He simply let it happen, the birth of a spectacle to the outside world. The Whittakers were fascinating. America's most inbred family. That phrase, cruel and dehumanizing, spread like wildfire online. People who had never stepped foot in West Virginia felt entitled to judge, to mock, to analyze. What should have been handled with sensitivity became entertainment. Some saw tragedy. Others saw profit. And while the world debated, Larry Whittaker stood by, watching his family become an internet phenomenon, not through achievement or choice, but through the lens of exploitation. Each visit from a content creator brought new chaos. Some came with kindness, bringing food, supplies, and money. Others came for shock value, recording the family's home, their mannerisms, and their vulnerabilities for clicks. The Whittaker story stopped being a story. It became a brand. And through it all, Larry's silence allowed it to grow unchecked. Asterisk, he didn't demand contracts. He didn't set boundaries. He didn't step between the cameras and his family. He let them film, let them question, let them profit. He had become an observer of his own life, a man standing in the ashes of his legacy, watching strangers collect the remains, the cost of fame for a time. The world claimed to care. People donated money. They offered help. They promised better living conditions, better opportunities, a better future. But help without structure only causes more harm. No one managed the donations properly. No one tracked who was giving what or where it went. Promised improvements were never completed. And Betty, overwhelmed and easily persuaded, believed every smiling face that promised her something new. The money came in. The money disappeared, and the home stayed the same. The truth was that attention had made things worse, not better. The more famous the Whittakers became, the less control they had over their lives. People showed up uninvited, taking photos, shouting from the road, leaving notes and gifts on the property. Volunteers tried to clean, to repair, to restore, but even their efforts were swallowed by disorganization and false hope. And all the while, Larry stayed in the background, the man who could have organized the help, who could have demanded accountability, who could have stopped the exploitation, said nothing. Maybe he thought the attention would fade. Maybe he thought things would sort themselves out. But silence doesn't protect. It destroys. The manipulation of Betty Whittaker became the face of the family. She was the one who talked to visitors, the one seen most often in interviews, the one who seemed to run things, but the truth was sadder than it seemed. Betty was not equipped to make complex decisions. Her understanding of business, money, and media was minimal. She didn't fully grasp how viral the family had become or how much revenue their image was generating for others. She was trusting, too trusting, and people used that. There were times when she would say she hadn't been paid, even after filming multiple videos. Other times, she would claim she received money, but no one could verify how much. And Larry? He stood right there through all of it. He could have intervened. He could have demanded receipts, contracts, agreements. He could have shielded Betty from manipulation, but he didn't. He watched her make deals she didn't understand. He watched her welcome strangers into their home again and again. He watched her bear the emotional and financial fallout of every decision. And when those decisions led to disaster, when the house fell apart, when Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray were taken, Larry quietly stepped aside, as if none of it had anything to do with him. That silence, that refusal to lead, made him complicit. The broken image the Whittakers' online fame came with a cruel irony. The more popular they became, the worse their lives got. The world claimed to love them, but love doesn't watch suffering and do nothing. Viewers consumed their pain as entertainment. The family's dysfunction was replayed, paused, and commented on. It wasn't admiration, it was voyeurism. Behind every viral video was a group of people being stripped of privacy, of dignity, of choice. And yet, the man who could have stopped it, the man whose word could have ended the filming, stayed quiet, Larry Whittaker had power, not wealth, not influence, but authority, the kind that comes from being the eldest, the patriarch, the man whose voice carries weight inside a family, but he never used it. Instead, he let strangers define his family's legacy, volunteers, and false hope. When the county removed the most vulnerable members of the family, the internet reacted. Shock, anger, pity, and for a short time, action. People organized fundraisers, volunteers, offered to clean and repair the property. Donations were sent to help Betty and Larry get the house in shape so the family might be reunited. But good intentions don't always bring good outcomes. The volunteers who arrived quickly realized that this wasn't just a dirty home, it was a hazardous one. Animal waste, garbage, and mold covered every surface. The air was thick with rot. The deeper they cleaned, the more overwhelming the task became. It wasn't about cleaning anymore. It was about confronting a lifetime of neglect, even as strangers worked tirelessly to make the home livable again. The core problem remained. The people who lived there were not changing. Without mental health treatment, without therapy, without leadership, the same cycle would repeat. And it did. Each cleanup was temporary. Within weeks, the clutter returned. The same habits resurfaced. The same silence filled the air, because you can't fix a broken system with bleach. The real repair had to start inside the hearts and minds of the family members, and that, too, required leadership. The kind Larry never provided. Larry's guilt and denial in the months following the removal. Those who visited noticed something different in Larry. He was quieter, even more withdrawn than before. His usual stoic presence now carried a weight of sadness. He rarely mentioned his siblings. He didn't ask for help. He didn't show anger toward the county. He didn't show emotion at all. He just carried on, tending to small chores, walking the property, staring at the road where so many visitors had once arrived. People who spoke to him said he seemed lost, like a man living among ghosts, and maybe that's what he was. Every wall in that house whispered with memories. Every shadow reminded him of the people who were gone. But guilt doesn't bring back what silence destroyed. It only deepens the loneliness. Larry's refusal to act, his lifelong avoidance of confrontation, had finally caught up with him. He had lost the very people he was meant to protect. He had allowed the world to invade their lives, to turn their suffering into a spectacle. And in the end, he had nothing left to show for it. A family consumed by the world. The story of the Whittakers became a mirror held up to society. It revealed how quickly compassion turns into consumption, how the internet takes tragedy and turns it into content. People claim to care, but few ask the real questions. Why wasn't Larry stepping up? Why wasn't there oversight? Why did so many outsiders have access to the most vulnerable members of the family? Because the truth was uncomfortable. The Whittakers' suffering was profitable. Their pain made views. Their dysfunction drew donations. Their story entertained millions. And while the world gained, the family lost everything. They lost their home, their privacy, their unity, their dignity, all because one man refused to take responsibility. The tragedy of the silent leader, Larry Whittaker's failure wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was quiet, painfully quiet. He didn't scream. He didn't lash out. He simply didn't do anything. And sometimes that's worse, because while people think destruction comes from noise, the truth is that silence can destroy more completely. Larry's silence gave permission. Permission for outsiders to exploit. Permission for Betty to mismanage. Permission for neglect to fester. And by the time he understood the consequences of that silence, it was irreversible. The Whittakers were gone. The house was condemned, and the family's legacy was no longer theirs to tell. The hard truth: when history looks back on the Whittaker story, it will remember many things: the poverty, the fame, the exploitation, the tragedy, but at its center will always be one question: where was Larry? He was there, but he wasn't present. He lived, but he didn't lead. He watched, but he didn't act. He had one job: protect his family, and in failing that, he lost them all. The hill where the Whittaker home stands is quiet now. No cameras, No laughter. No chaos. Just silence, the same silence that began this story. And the same silence that ended it. Larry Whittaker still lives there, a man surrounded by memories. Ghosts and the echoes of choices never made, the road that once led journalists, filmmakers, and volunteers to his doorstep has grown cold. The world has moved on, but for Larry, time has stood still. He walks the same path every day. Past the same worn fences and the same broken boards. To outsiders, it might look like peace. But for Larry, it's a reminder that the family he was meant to protect is gone. Timmy, Lorraine, Ray. Taken. Their rooms empty. Their laughter replaced by the sound of wind through cracked windows, and Betty, the woman who once stood beside him, trying to hold it all together, is left with the weight of her own choices. She believed she could save them. But she too was failed by the man who should have led them all. Larry Whittaker's story isn't one of evil. It's one of absence. The absence of courage, the absence of accountability. The absence of protection when it was needed most. For years people have asked, how could this happen? The answer lies in the silence. When families stop communicating, when no one steps up, when no one takes responsibility, pain festers, problems grow, and love alone isn't enough to hold it all together. Larry's failure wasn't in his heart. It was in his fear of confrontation, fear of change, fear of facing the truth about the family's decline, and so he stayed, quiet while the home decayed. While outsiders profited, while the people he loved slipped away. Now, the Whittaker name is known across the world, but not for triumph or resilience. It's known as a warning, a reminder that neglect destroys. As surely as cruelty, that silence can wound deeper than words, and that leadership, when abandoned, can take generations down with it. Larry Whittaker had one job: protect his family. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't take control. He didn't fight. He just stood there and watched as everything he loved disappeared. The Whittaker story began as a portrait of endurance. It ended as a tragedy of silence. And in the quiet hills of West Virginia, the last sound that remains is the echo of what could have been. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.